Hi. I feel it's been such a long time since I've done this that uh, I feel both excited and a little bit nervous. Um, also, um, the book that I want to explore in this episode podcast, what have you? It's a very sensitive um, story. It's a very harrowing story. It's a very intense story. Um, it's called Framed as a Terrorist, My 14 Years Struggle to Prove My Innocence. And this is Mohammad Aamir Khan's story, and it's been translated by Nandita Haksar. And I happen to know Amir Bhai, unfortunately not very well, but I do know him. And he told me his story himself, and he directed me to interviews and journals who journalists who had chosen to cover his story and bring to light the plight of poor Muslim youth. And I wouldn't just say Muslim, any minority, any oppressed minority, especially when they're poor, and how they struggle um, disproportionately at the hands of a system that doesn't favor, doesn't want to, doesn't is not invested in their, you know. So I'm very I'll just be honest that I'm very scared about how I'm going to tell this story, because I also don't plan on reading every chapter. I have some sense of how I want to go about this. And let me first just begin by saying why I chose this book to read. Um, well, the first biggest reason was because of the arrests of political prisoners, excuse me, who all happened to be Muslim ever since the Delhi riots began. Uh, so, although Amir Bhai's story is different from theirs in that he was not a politicized figure, he was very young, he was abducted, he was framed, uh, but he had never participated in any political activity for him to have been for such a charge to have been leveled at him. Nevertheless, it's still appropriate. His story is still relevant because it does tell you about what happens, how communal prejudices work their ways into systems, and how innocents uh, lose half their lives, you know, trying to prove, trying to get the truth out and prove their innocence. And I think maybe somewhere when Umar Khalid was arrested, not that I didn't have, sorry, sympathies for other Muslim prisoners, but somewhere when Umar Khalid was arrested, I don't know, something inside me just snapped. Anyway, so that's one reason why I think this book, which I would highly recommend all of you should pick up, one reason why I have decided to pick this up. The second reason I want to do this is because I want to bring to light all the ways in which the system fails people like Amir Bhai, like all the things that went wrong in his trial. So Nandita Haksar, she provides a background to what the system should have done and what it did instead. So I think it's very important to bring that to light. And the third very simple reason is that I just believe that his story needs to be told and never be forgotten. And for that reason, I'm going to issue a trigger warning right away, although I'm not going to get into the section of the book which is the part where one would get triggered, is likely to get triggered. So he was tortured when he was abducted, and the scenes described in this book are extremely graphic and disturbing. So I'm going to issue a trigger warning again next whenever I get to that chapter. But I personally believe that it is extremely important for us to not to engage, even if it means that it comes at some emotional and mental distress, because I don't think Aamir Bhai had the choice of walking away from what happened to him, and I think it's our responsibility as citizens, as people who are fighting for human rights, to listen despite wanting to, despite that being the last thing we would want to do, despite our instincts telling us to just. So just going to tell you, I'm going to describe some really graphic scenes. Yeah, so those are the three main reasons. I'm sure there must be a lot of other reasons why I've picked up Aamir Bhai's book, but and obviously since he's not the first, nor will he be the last to have gone through this horrific ordeal, but because I happen to know him to some degree, I think it's important for me to talk about this. Okay, so I think we can get inside the book. So it begins with some background and context into the kind of life that Aamir Bhai was living, and it before we begin his autobiographical narrative, Nandita Haksar kind of provides a context that's research and biographical based. So she talks about so Aamir Bhai lived. Does he still live in Delhi, Old Delhi? I think I missed that, but he grew up in Old Delhi. And so she basically charts down in brief the history of Old Delhi from Shahjahanabad to the, to the kind of slum that it has become ever since we were colonized. Then she talks about, okay, I think this may be something I want to read. So this is page 5, where she talks about how, okay, I'll just read it out. So she says, in many ways, Aamir is a victim of partition. His own family was partitioned when his older sister married a Pakistani. Thus, for the families who were divided by international borders, the partition isn't something which happened in the past. It continues to impact their lives on a daily basis. Perhaps the most vulnerable victims of the partition are those who are drawn into the dark and murky world of spooks and spies and sleuths. Both countries are involved in intelligence gathering and counterintelligence, in which the spies or couriers get caught and are subjected to brutal torture and imprisonment for long years. The intelligence agencies do not take responsibility for their agents or their families. Many a family has lost their only breadwinner in this way. It is only recently that stories of these couriers and spies are coming out in the open. For instance, Ravinder Kaushik, a man who worked as a RAW agent, RAW agent, in Pakistan from the time he was 23 years old, was finally caught and died in a Pakistani jail. He is neither celebrated nor a hero for his country. Even though his family claimed that the Bollywood film Ek Tha Tiger was based on his story, the film's director denied it. Aamir was recruited to be a courier but not given any training. Published reports state that even couriers are given training, and that the training capsules of 4 weeks entail learning the basics of intelligence activities, how to identify military vehicles, officer ranks, and the art of covering their tracks. Aamir did not have the skills or the training to be a courier. He had never smuggled anything even into his own classroom, let alone across the border. He was traveling under his own name, And if he had been caught, not only would he have landed in jail, but his sister's family would have been suspected of being Indian spies. It would most certainly have ruined him. So the context here is that Amir Bhai was around 18-19, and he was like is stated in this um, section of the book that I just read out. His sister had married someone in Pakistan, and she was now living in Pakistan. So he had so his family had not allowed him to visit Pakistan when he was younger because it wasn't safe, and it was only when he was an adult that he was allowed to travel. So, like before he was touted to go, he was approached by this mysterious man who claimed to work for an intelligence agency, who basically said that if you love your country, if you are a true patriot, I need you to carry out this act for me. So it was a very banal act. He was given some documents, he had to transfer them. It was very basic. So, and he was only 19, he was very naive. So the point that she's trying to make here is that even people who are made to carry out such banal acts are told the significance of such acts and are trained in order to make sure that they are not caught. And secondly, that if Amir knew the gravity of what this act entailed, like what it really meant to carry out these activities, he would not have done it, because it would have meant that his entire family would have been in jeopardy. So the fact that he was framed in a case like such, it also implies that no one really bothered to check up on his family history. Why would somebody want to put their family in such deep danger? So then she goes on to say, and the strangest part of this shadowy world is that Amir never knew the identity of the men who recruited him or to which agency they belonged. Unlike most Western countries, in India, the intelligence agencies don't have a clearly established or credible accountability mechanism. Therefore, the agents, such as the shadowy Gupta ji who contacted Amir, are never made accountable for their actions. The intelligence agencies are not subject to public scrutiny and are exempt from the ambit of the RTI law. They are not accountable to the Indian Parliament. Amir had never read spy stories, and he had no ambitions to become a hero. Therefore, he did what any untrained person would do when asked to smuggle something across a militarized border. What? He ran to the safety of his room, his home, his country. So the context here is that he took the documents that he was supposed to take from India to Pakistan, but when he went to Pakistan, he realized that some of the tasks that were asked for him to do, they were terrifying. So he didn't carry those out, but he did carry out one task. But when he collected the documents from the people in Pakistan, which he was supposed to bring back to India, as he was crossing the border to go back to India, he realized that the security there was very, very thorough, and he realized that he won't be able to get away with it. So he decided to dispose off of the material that he received, and that's what got him into trouble. When these men realized that he didn't do his job, they decided that we're going to screw you over, and they basically extracted false testimonies out of him. Anyways, I'm getting ahead of myself, but I just want to explain how his naivety was used to Okay, then the next section of this book is about police brutality. So the human rights movement in India and abroad has focused the world's attention on violence perpetuated by those who are charged with the duty of enforcing the law and keeping us safe from crime. Late Justice Anand Narayan Mulla of Allahabad High Court famously observed, "There is not a single lawless group in the whole of the country whose record of crime comes anywhere near the record of that single organized unit which is known as the Indian police force. Not only has the Indian police force become more brutal since he wrote these much quoted words, they are even given rewards and medals despite committing unspeakable crimes against hapless citizens. In international human rights parlance, these crimes are examples. Right. So, extrajudicial arrests, which Aamir rightly calls kidnapping, and extrajudicial killings, which are false encounters or custodial deaths due to torture, and extrajudicial detentions or illegal imprisonment, none of these words convey the full horror of the acts of vile brutality by the police. And the human rights community has for long called for reforms of the police. The conversations about police reform are based on different concerns. One which has been highlighted more recently is that communalism has been institutionalized within the police force mainly because of a lack of recruitment from the Muslim communities. The remedy that is recommended is to have more Muslims in the police force. So I think this is also relevant to the Black Lives Matter movement, where we see an institutionalization of unequal treatment and the normalization of discrimination and brutal treatment in the name of fighting crime. So the demands has been this. So the reform of the police force. This demand has been most vociferously articulated by Muslim leaders. While the demand has some validity, it does not go to the root of the problem. It is very important to remember that merely having more Muslims in the police force will not solve the problem. Just as having more women in the police force will not stop the violence against women. Efforts to recruit more members of minority ethnic groups or races into police forces in the United Kingdom and the United States has not led to the eradication of the institutional racism. And we know that. So this book was written in 2015, if I'm not wrong. And so this is 2020, and we have our exhibit A in front of us. Among the most heinous crimes committed by the police is torture, which is banned under international human rights law. Human rights groups in India have been documenting the institutionalized use of torture by both the police and the security forces, including the armed forces. These reports are publicized and a general public awareness has been created. However, the issue of torture has not taken central stage in Indian politics as it has in the United States of America after the media exposed the brutality of the torture methods used in Abu Ghraib detention center. American citizens have been shocked and outraged and sparked off a national debate on the use of torture against prisoners. In India, there has been no moral outrage against institutionalized brutalities by law enforcement agencies. On the contrary, oftentimes the public in India has demanded that more powers to be given to the police must be given to the police to arrest and detain, lowering the standards for fair trial and harsher punishments for the convicted. These demands have the effect of lowering international human rights standards, and this in turn has political consequences which could endanger the security of the country. A highly trained interrogator of the US military, Chris Mackey, who has written the book The Interrogators, has concluded, and this is his quote, "The reason the United States should not torture prisoners is not because it doesn't work. It is simply because it is wrong. It dehumanizes us, undermines our cause, and over the long term breeds more enemies to the United States than coercive interrogation methods will ever allow us to capture. Allowing our police to commit crimes with impunity and not making intelligence agents accountable has led to serious undermining of the protections guaranteed in our Constitution. The international human rights community has found another euphemism. Amnesty International calls the extrajudicial system the shadow system of justice. To my mind, the word justice is entirely inappropriate. While the human rights community has worked for the abolishment of torture and the death penalty and reform of the police, those who have actually been victims of police brutalities have argued forcefully that the police as an institution should be abolished. While doing research for this book, I came across a blog which had posted 50 reasons to abolish the cops. I showed it to Aamir. He laughed and asked, "How can that be possible?" So that's the end of this section of the book. Then there's the section of the book which is called The Insidious Art of Framing. And it goes on to say, human rights lawyers stress the importance of pre-trial procedural safeguards for the protection of the accused, especially protection from torture in police custody and also to ensure a fair trial. At a pre-trial stage, the role of the magistrate before whom the accused is produced is crucial. The magistrate can ascertain whether the accused has been tortured and whether the arrest has been made legally and whether the accused has been given access to a lawyer. The doctor who examines the accused at this stage can record whether the accused has been tortured. Aamir was denied all these safeguards by the police, the magistrates, and the doctors. These safeguards are routinely denied to almost all poor people who are arrested or kidnapped by the police. The denial of these rights helps the police to frame people in false cases by allowing them to elicit false confessions, fabricate evidence, and instill fear in the accused so he doesn't speak out. The police would find it very difficult to frame people if these procedures were followed in letter and in spirit. Therefore, it's important to step by step understand how Aamir was framed. Aamir was in effect kidnapped by the police in the night, so there was no record of witnesses to his arrest. There was no record of the names of the police officers responsible for the arrest or the circumstances of his arrest. This was in clear violation of the procedures laid down by law as well as the Supreme Court. Since there was no record of the time of arrest, Aamir could be kept in illegal custody and the police could torture him and break his will to protect himself. If he was arrested legally, he would have to be produced before the magistrate within 24 hours. In this case, he was kept for 8 days at the police station without access to a lawyer, magistrate, or any relative. Aamir could have died in the police custody and there would have been no record of his disappearance or his death. In human rights jargon, this would have been enforced disappearance. Official statistics show that on an average, 4 people die every day in India in either police or judicial custody. This was a time that the police was able to obtain Aamir's signature on innumerable blank pieces of paper and make him write into blank diaries. And they made him give false confessions to people injured in the bomb blast so that they would later identify him in court. When the police finally produced Aamir before the magistrate did not bother to ask Aamir when and how he was arrested or whether he had access to any legal advice. On the day Aamir was first produced in court, the magistrate, the lawyer, and the police spoke in English, a language that Aamir did not understand. The doctors, with the exception of 2, failed to do their duty to uphold the ethics of their profession. They should have honestly recorded the injuries they found on Aamir the trauma he was going through, and the details of his torture. The courts allowed the police to have remand for 19 cases, even though there was no prima facie evidence against Aamir except the so-called disclosure statement he was supposed to have made when he was in police custody. Every judge knows that a disclosure statement or a confession made to the police is not admissible by law. Aamir was kept in legal remand for nearly 2 months, in which time the police created further evidence in order to frame him in 19 bomb blast cases. Aamir was made to sign blank pieces of paper, write in diaries, and give false statements that he had bought chemicals from shopkeepers to make the bombs. Procedural safeguards are very inadequate protection against violation of human rights by the police, but enforcement of these procedures can often save a person from death in police custody, torture, or from being framed. So then she writes down the guidelines which are part of that must be followed at the time of arrest. I think I'm going to skip that because this is easily available on the web. I'm going to get to the part where we try to understand why was Aamir of all people framed, why not anyone else. So Nandita Haksar asks or writes, poses this rhetorical question: why did the police frame Aamir? Well, one explanation could be that they were under enormous pressure to arrest someone in the Delhi blast cases. Or was it just greed? They knew they would get a large cash reward. But then why was Gupta ji and the intelligence agencies a party to this massive frame-up? In India, the intelligence agencies have been set up by executive orders and not through acts passed by the parliament. Therefore, there is no accountability to the people or to the parliament. There is no record of how many people have been framed by the police, how many have been able to prove that they've been framed, and whether any policeman has been punished for framing an innocent citizen. While it is true that there is a disproportionate number of Muslim youth who are being framed in false cases, the police frame people in other circumstances. For instance, Premlal was framed in 18 false criminal cases from 1991 to 2007. It started when he reported a theft in his house and the police recovered the goods for him but did not return it to him. He then filed a series of criminal cases and then he spent 7 years in jail. In 2010, he filed for rupees 60 lakh compensation but was only rewarded 5. The police was not punished. While it took the police 2 months to frame Aamir, it took him more than 14 years to prove his innocence. Then we go on to the section called Proving Innocence. The idea that a person is innocent till he or she is proven guilty is not a modern one. It has been part of Islamic jurisprudence as well as Roman criminal law. It's based on a simple assumption that most people are not criminals. Therefore, the burden of proof should be on the person who declares, not the one who denies. Under Indian Criminal Code, the accused is presumed innocent till the time the prosecution can collect and present in a court of law compelling evidence of guilt. This presumption of innocence is the cornerstone of human rights jurisprudence. Even after spending nearly 14 years in jail, being acquitted in 17 cases, and being released, Aamir is still fighting to prove his innocence. It seems that under the Indian criminal justice system, it's easier to prove an innocent man guilty than for a guilty man to prove his for an innocent man to prove his innocence. The criminal justice system works in many ways against the innocent, especially if they are poor and can't afford competent but expensive lawyers. The most crucial time for an accused is the time immediately after the arrest. especially an illegal arrest. I asked Aamir whether he'd asked his mother what she'd done when he didn't return the day he was kidnapped. He said he never had the opportunity to find out what she did all those days when she didn't return and his father was away. Even when her husband returned from Allahabad, they were not at all sure what to do. Aamir asked what she could have done. I said that she could have reported to the police station or sent a telegram to the Indian Human Rights Commission. And Aamir looked at me incredulously. Did I really think that ordinary, honest folk know all these procedures? Aamir said that in the beginning, each time when his mother visited him in jail, she would just cry with tears rolling down her cheeks. It was only much later that she told him that a man called Muhammad had come and asked for his passport and identity papers. The man had produced a note written to her by Aamir in Urdu, and this note had been extracted from Aamir while he was being tortured. And that's why she handed him all the documents, that she had no idea that these were, fraud. The defense lawyer should have asked the mother and tried to find out all that happened after her son disappeared. Her testimony would have proved that the police was telling a lie about the time and date of the arrest. The police claimed to have arrested Aamir on February 1998, when in fact they had February 28, 1998, when in fact he had been kidnapped 8 days prior on February 20, 1998. Her testimony could have proved that he had been illegally arrested and detained long before the date of arrest written in the first information report, and the police story would have been easily disproved. Aamir's mother was finally produced as a defense witness during his trial in Ghaziabad in 2011. That too on the suggestion of the trial court judge. By the way, 2011 is 13 years and 10 months after Aamir was arrested. 13 years later, the judge suggests that perhaps the mother could be used as a witness for defense. It took them 13 years to come to that realization, to offer this suggestion. By then, her speech was slurred and she came in a wheelchair. The remarkable aspect of Aamir's trials were the prosecution witnesses. Many of them were victims of the bomb blasts, and they could have succumbed to the pressure of the police to identify Aamir as the man who was responsible for the blasts. But these witnesses refused to believe the police, and they refused to testify falsely. The prosecution declared their own witnesses hostile and cross-examined them. And normally this is the defense lawyer's job. But even under relentless cross-examination, the witnesses refused to lie. From the year 2000, Aamir was denied the right to be tried in an open court. His trials should have been held near Thees Hazari, which was nearer to his parents' home. But the court allowed the trials to be held deep inside the Tihar jail complex. Why did the court allow this, and why did the defense lawyer not challenge this decision? In case after case, the judge acquitted Aamir. He recorded in his judgments that the prosecution witnesses did not support the prosecution story, and he acquitted Aamir. However, in several judgments, the judge said that he was acquitting Aamir by giving him the benefit of the doubt. There was no question to the judge. There was no one to question the judge and ask him that if there is no evidence, then where was the question of benefit of doubt? This fact would be used later to deny Aamir compensation for illegal arrest, torture, and illegal detention for nearly 14 years. So because he was arrested, because his acquittal happened not because he was innocent, but because there was not sufficient evidence, quote unquote, not sufficient evidence, the compensation that he was entitled to receive for being framed or for being kept in lockup despite being innocent was significantly reduced. and he did not get the, well, his dignity was gone, and now so was his bank account. Like, his bank account was, yeah, so he was not given the appropriate compensation for the torture. The war against terrorism had not even officially begun, but the political atmosphere was already surcharged. The media celebrated the arrest of every person accused of terrorism, but they didn't report when an innocent man was acquitted. A Muslim accused in a bomb blast case would inevitably be presumed guilty even before the trial began, and things would get much worse by the end of 2001. Then we get to the section of politics of hatred. There are many extrajudicial factors that impact the outcome of a trial or whether a trial takes place at all. These are the media, the political atmosphere, prejudices of the judge, and the attitudes of the public at large. In India's war against terrorism, the first casualty has been human rights standards. The anti-terrorism laws invariably reversed the burden of proof. In other words, the accused is presumed guilty until he can prove himself innocent. While in jail, Aamir met many Sikhs and Muslims arrested under TADA, which is the Terrorist and Disruptive Activities Prevention Act of 1985. Although the act had lapsed in 1995, the men arrested had been tried under its provisions. By the time the anti-terrorist law had been proved ineffective in curbing terrorism and had led to the arrest of hundreds of people in Gujarat, where there were neither any terrorist activity at the time nor there was any insurgency. And now this is a very important statement. So on August 1994, Union Minister of State for Home Rajesh Pilot told the Parliament that of approximately 67,000 individuals detained since TADA came into force, 8,000 were tried and only 725 persons were convicted, meaning of the 67,000 people who were believed to be terrorists, only 725 were actually proved as and they were the ones that were convicted. We don't know if they were truly guilty. We know they were convicted. Some 59,000 people have been detained with no case being brought against them. The TADA review committees found that except in 5,000 cases, the application of TADA was wrong and asked for the withdrawal of the cases. So of the 59,000 people, apart from 5,000 cases, all the applications themselves were wrong. So that's 54,000 people stuck in a system, and they're not just people. They're a very specific identity, class, caste, religious minority, sect of this society that gets stuck in this loop. Despite the admissibility of the confessions made to the police as evidence, which were invariably made under torture, the conviction rate was less than 1%. Yet, thousands of people underwent prolonged detention without ever being convicted. The maximum number of arrests under TADA were not in Punjab or Jammu and Kashmir or Northeast India, but in Gujarat, which has no record of terrorism. The majority of victims belonged to religious minorities. The victims belonged to religious minorities. Aamir was himself treated as a terrorist from the time he entered the jail. Jail authorities wanted to put him in the high-risk cell even though he was barely 20 years old and a first-time offender. When he was first sent to jail, the doctor refused to certify him fit to live in an isolation ward where even grown men with firmly held political beliefs went mad. But he was still sent to that high-risk ward after barely 2 years of his detention, and that's where he stayed for most of the time he was in prison. The cell was like a cage. He was deprived of his rights to study, to use the library, or play games. He could go out of his small cell for just 2 or 4 hours a day, and the rest of the time he was just confined. Putting a person in isolation inside a cell or a cage, even though he is an under trial prisoner, amounts to giving punishment even before conviction. This is often justified on the ground that the prisoner may try to escape or do harm to others. It was during this detention in the high-risk cell that Aamir met many political prisoners, mainly Sikhs, fighting for Khalistan, and Muslims dreaming of Salafate. Aamir noticed the growing number of Muslims in high security cells. He was troubled by this fact and he tried to understand the reasons why. Aamir asked the men from SIMI for answers. So SIMI is the Students' Islamic Movement of India, which has been banned since 2001. A study of SIMI established in 1977 and banned in 2001 concluded that given the pervasive social inequality of India's Muslim population, the internationalization of jihadi groups operating in the guise of social justice, and India's domestic barriers to developing a robust internal security apparatus, India's citizenry will remain vulnerable, as will other domestic and international terrorism targets within India. So the point that she's trying to make here is that there were many radicalized groups that were extremely disillusioned by the treatment of religious minorities and other minorities in India, and for them the only option seemed to be some kind of separation, a very permanent separation where there is a complete separation is the right way to put it. So the point she's trying to make is that given the state of affairs, given how life was turning out to be for Aamir, he could have very easily have been radicalized by the youth that were being attracted to such political thought, but he never let go of the democratic and secular values that were instilled in him as he was growing up. So I think there is one important section which talks about why prisons should be abolished, after which I think that I would straight up go to what happened to Aamir Bhai when he was tortured. So, abolish the prisons. There are 9 million prisoners in the world and the figure is only growing. Recent debate on the prison system have been focused largely on the rise of Muslim youth in prisons, both in the West and in India. Many of these youth have been framed in false terror cases. Increasingly, states are justifying these frame-ups in the name of national security, and as a result, international human rights standards have been significantly lowered by anti-terrorism laws. Remember that these anti-terrorism laws presume guilt, which goes against the very fabric of justice in almost every other kind of fight for. In every other case except under these terrorism laws, you are presumed innocent, but under these terrorism laws, you are presumed guilty. So this has reduced, like I'm just reiterating what has been said in the previous chapters in case you all have forgotten. So the number of Muslim convicts and British prisoners has surpassed the 11,000 mark for the first time, and this book has been written in 2015, so I don't even know what the stats are today, but at that point it had surpassed the 11,000 mark for the first time according to a new report, Prison Population Statistics. The statistics show that the Muslim inmates in England and Wales jumped to 11,248 in 2012, up from 3,681 in 1997. That is the 4 times more than what it was, like close to 4 times. Stated another way, over the past 15 years, the number of Muslims in British prisons has jumped by more than 200%. The increase of Muslim inmates in British prisons is 8 times faster than that of the overall prison population, and the numbers show a clear overrepresentation of Muslim convicts. Muslims, who make up roughly 5% of the British population as a whole, make up 13% of the British prison population, and this was 6% in 1997. In India, there's a similar trend. The statistical data of the National Crime Record Bureau from the year 2001 to 2012 shows that the percentage of Muslims in prisons of the total prison population has always been greater than the share of Indian Muslims in the country's population. The data also shows that nearly 55% of Muslim convicts are in jail of 4 states: Maharashtra, Madhya Pradesh, Uttar Pradesh, and West Bengal. While it is of utmost importance to highlight the fact that a disproportionate number of Muslims are in jail, the fact remains that the largest number of people in jail are poor. This is true of both Western jails as well as in India. The prime targets of unjust criminal justice systems are the poor. And often, the root cause of Muslim anger is that the community has been deprived of its just and due share in the country's development. This is a fact that seems to have been pushed to the background in the current discourse on prisoners' rights. In India, so many poor are languishing in jail even after they've been acquitted, only because the system and their family just forgot them. It is true that even now, by global standards, India locks up lesser number of people than many other countries. Some 3,70,000 inmates, 2/3 awaiting trial, are spread across 1,400 jails. That represents approximately 30 persons in prison per 100,000, per 1 lakh. A far low incarceration rate than in China, which is 170, let alone America, which is 730. So US prison statistics show that nearly 50% of the prisoners are black, 18% are Hispanic. However, the curious fact is that despite these figures, most prisons are located in white neighborhoods. While prisons are used as instruments for oppressing minorities, they have another function which is barely visible in India so far. Prisons are a source of livelihood for a number of people and corporations. It was found that in the USA, a prison warden could make himself a millionaire if he owned even a single payphone. The US Telecommunications Corporation AT&T estimated that the inmates of prisons across the country made long-distance calls worth $1 billion annually. So, there are no comparable figures in India, but it's now become clear why Tihar jail has recently started allowing the prisoners to make calls. It also explains the rapid expansion of its economic activities such as a bakery and a restaurant, and recently a mobile factory has opened an ancillary unit in Tihar, which is an obvious source of cheap labor. The Supreme Court has recently ordered the release of all under trial prisoners who've spent half their maximum sentence prescribed from the offences they are charged with. The court has assigned the task to lower judicial officers to visit each jail under their jurisdiction from 1st October 2014 and complete the task of releasing them within 2 months. However, there is no news of how far this task has progressed. The Supreme Court order is just one step in the direction of prison reform. Many people have been calling for abolishment of prison as a form of punishment altogether. There is an increasing awareness that prison as an institution is obsolete. Joan Baez. I know this singer because my father listens to her songs. So she sang "We Shall Raise the Prisons to the Ground" in the 1970s, and Angela Davis, the black American leader, has said that the prisons need to be abolished as the dominant mode of addressing social problems that are better solved by other institutions. So it's no longer people who are in the fringe that are asking for the abolishment of prisons, but the UN also has published a report which is called the Alternative to Imprisonment, which observes that the overall use of imprisonment is rising throughout the world, while there is little evidence that its increasing use is improving public safety. And one could argue that Aamir's case is a dramatic example of why prisons should be abolished. So this is Nandita Haksar's introduction, and sort of she kind of gives you the political landscape of not only the time during which Aamir Bhai was tortured and kidnapped, but also the kind of thought, like the kind of thought things that were happening, the whole idea of abolishing prisons. And so my point is that this was the background and the context. Now I'm going to go straight to the part where Aamir Bhai was okay. Actually, I'm going to read out this really short, this tiny little, this tiny excerpt from Aamir Bhai's autobiographical account of what it was like growing up in Delhi 6. So this is page 57. So he basically talks about what happened during the Sikh riots and just the state of minorities living in India. Ammi and Abbu were always telling me to be home before dark. There were some days I remember I was not allowed to go out at all. Abbu said that there was some trouble in the city and it was safer if we stayed indoors. I remember he mentioned words such as curfew, riots, and police firing. But these words had no bearing on our lives, except that we stayed at home. I do have scattered memories about incidents which made me aware that the world outside my home was not always safe and that there was danger lurking in an undefined space. One day I was on the roof with my kites and I saw Shishganj Gurdwara burn. I could see the flames. My friend Punnu cut his hair, but I didn't understand the significance of his act, so Punnu was a Sikh boy. It was during this time that Punnu's brother refused to go to the Gurdwara and went only to the temple. I also remember the Sikhs shutting their shops and many ran into our locality for protection. And Abu's friend, Uncle Kukku, came to stay with us for a few days. I also remember a neighborhood uncle who wanted to become a pilot. He was somewhat of a local hero because no one had ever achieved something so big in our neighborhood. He lived next door and had taken his training but not yet given his exams. On the day he was to leave to give his exams, there was a curfew. And despite his showing his identity card and exam admit card, the police didn't let him go. As a result, he never became a pilot. Now, he sells knickknacks on the pavement in Chandni Chowk or on the Sunday Bazaar. I remember this story because Ammi told me the story, and even now I see him in our neighborhood. I wasn't interested in politics, but I do remember that Abbu always warned us to beware of Sangees who wore khaki shorts and black topis. He said they were dangerous because they hated Muslims. I had no idea of the difference between the RSS, the BJP and the Jan Sanghi. For us, they were all Sangees. And we would see them early in the morning when they gathered, especially near the town hall. We were also scared of the police because during Hindu-Muslim tension, the police took the side of the Hindus and they beat up the Muslims. At least that's what I would hear from Abu and sometimes from the bazaar when I met my friends. I was told that a distant relative of Ammi was killed by the police while he was trying to closed the gate into his gully during the Hindu-Muslim riots in 1983, or perhaps it was 1986. His brother, Mohammad Ahmad, who I call Mamu, is still alive, and he used to work for Kami Awaz. Now he's more religious. So there was this one time where Abu came back home quite agitated. He told us that a young Muslim man had been shot dead by a police while trying to stop the rioting. His name was Subhanallah. Later, a chowk near Hamdar Dawakhana in Lal Kuan was called Shahid Chowk to commemorate him. That's Shaheed Chowk. There is one thing I remember which did leave a deep impression in my mind. One day I noticed that a young man I knew called Babbal was hiding inside a lathi machine workshop that belonged to one Gulzar who lived in the next gully. I saw people taking food for him inside the shop and then locking him inside. I was curious and asked Praveen Baji, who lived near our house, what the meaning of this act was. So she told me that there was tension between Hindus and Muslims and the police were looking for young Muslim men. She said that Muslim youth had to be careful. When she saw the fear in my eyes, she said I need not worry. I was too small and the police wouldn't take me anyway. So this is a growing consciousness in young Aamir, who starts to understand that his perfect childhood and his loving parents and his pristine, relationships with people, they're not as perfect as they seemed. He may not have understood the larger political context of what was happening and why he was asked to be vigilant, but there was a sense that he needed to be careful. So this is important because this serves as a background to the communal tensions that he was being warned about and the way he was treated when he was being tortured. So this is where I should issue a trigger warning, because now I want to read the part where he is going to be tortured. Yeah. Right. So there's actually quite a lot to cover here, so I'm just trying to figure out where to begin. Right. So here's when he gets kidnapped. On Friday, 20th February 1997, if I'm not wrong, 1998, I told Ammi I was going for the night namaz and that from the mosque I intended to go to the medicine shop to buy the medicine prescribed by Hakim Sahib in Karachi. By the way, this happens after he's met that mysterious Gupta ji who has asked him to perform, to take up these tasks in the name of patriotism, and he's travelled from India to Karachi and back to India. And he kind of goes on with his life, so he does meet that Gupta ji again and he shows a significant amount of anger, but there's nothing much he can do, or so Aamir thinks. So he goes about his life as it was. I went for the namaz and then started walking back towards Bahadurgarh Road in Sadar Bazaar towards the medicine shop. The wholesale market had closed, and they closed much sooner than the retail shops, and as I walked there weren't many people around. It was dark and the winter chill was still in the air. From the corner of my eye, I saw a white gypsy vehicle ahead of me. As I advanced, it started moving very slowly and I instinctively walked faster. Suddenly, I was pushed violently from the back and I fell. Some people came out of the gypsy and caught me before I fell and pulled me into the car. I was pushed down on the floor of the car. My hands were quickly tied and I was blindfolded. Although I was very scared, I managed to ask why they were kidnapping me. I thought they were criminals who were looking for someone who would help them get the ransom money. It could not be any enmity because Abu didn't have any enemies. Sorry, I just wanted to change the angle. Right. I really thought the people who had pushed me into the vehicle were criminals. I had no idea that the police could break the law and indulge in kidnapping. That's why I picked up the courage and asked them what they'd hoped to get from me. So he thought that he was being kidnapped by criminals before he realized that it was actually police officials who were doing the kidnapping. So when he asked them what they wanted, one man replied that I would soon know what they would get. After about half an hour, the vehicle stopped and I was taken down. I was made to walk. I got the sense that there were several people there and I could hear another car. I heard someone say, "Come behind us," and that the work is done. The tone and the tenor of the voice was like that of a Delhi Jat's bus conductor and drivers. So this was what convinced me more that I was in the hand of criminals. I stumbled into a drain and got hurt. I was lifted out. After that, I could feel I had been brought into a room. Here, they took off my blindfold and untied my hands. I saw 10 to 12 men standing facing me. They looked strong and muscular and totally dehumanized. No one said anything except one who ordered me to take off my clothes. I was so embarrassed. They had no shame. They made me take off all my clothes, and when they saw I had no underwear, one man remarked, "Saale ye underwear bhi nahi pehante." And this remark wasn't just personal, it was communal. Then they all started hitting me. I was slapped, kicked, elbowed, boxed, and my hair pulled so hard that I thought my neck would break. All the while, they also abused me verbally. I had never heard such dirty and foul, violent language. The abusive language was full of anti-Muslim innuendos. The only word that comes to my mind which describes those men is Jallad. The men seemed genuinely angry, and their anger had destroyed their humanity and the ability to feel any compassion for a fellow human being. They kept beating me till I fell down and blood came out of my mouth. I fell numb except for the excruciating pain in my broken right jaw. I kept asking them why they were beating me and screaming, "Hai Ammi, Hai Allah," till I fell unconscious. But the torture had just begun. When I came to, I found I had been propped up against the wall, which had white tiles. Some other men were sitting on stools and chairs. They spoke in a better tone and started asking me questions. I was in no position to ask who they were and why I was being interrogated. They asked me my father's name and address and about my family. If I took time to reply, I was abused and slapped by my persecutors. Then I noticed Gupta ji was present in the room. I can't say what time it was, but it must have been late at night. He sat on the chair and he used really violent and abusive language. He demanded that I tell the truth. He said that I still had time, so I should tell the truth. He again asked about the bag with papers in Pakistan. He asked me whether I had given the bag to someone else. I repeated my story and I was beaten again. Gupta ji then said to the muscle man standing by, "Isko garam karo, abhi ye seedha nahi hua hai." Some of the men left. By now I realized these were policemen. There were around 5 or 6 left to carry out the heinous work on my body. Trigger warning. For those of you who don't want to listen, don't. But I'm going to choose to speak because I think it's our responsibility to listen to what happened. They made me sit up straight against the wall. One caught my right arm and the other left arm, so I was immobilized. Then one caught my left leg and the other my right leg. One of them held my stomach down. I watched in absolute horror as the two men slowly and deliberately started pulling my legs apart till they touched the back of the wall. I screamed. I cried out for mercy. At least I was able to scream and cry. That was my only freedom. The muscles in my legs were literally torn apart and I lost sensation in them. Then they brought my legs back together. I again fell unconscious. When I recovered consciousness, the torturers lifted me up, but I couldn't stand. They released me and I fell with a thud. 2 or 3 times I was lifted up and allowed to fall. Now there was no way I could escape. Gupta ji was sitting there throughout. The policeman kept urging me, "बोलो जो साहब कहते हैं वो बताओ." Next, they dragged me to a dark part of the room. My hands were tied at the back and I was lifted up with a chain. All my weight was on my shoulders. In seconds, the pain was unbearable. I felt the muscles of my arm break. I felt I was dying. They were standing and watching as if I was a spectacle. I lost consciousness again. When I regained consciousness, I found myself on the floor, my body racked in pain, and I was unable to move my arms. My mouth was dry and I wanted a drink of water. They refused to give me even a sip of water. I noticed that Gupta ji was still in the room. The torturers dragged me to a bench and made me lie on it. One really bulky man with red hair, a mustache, and a face which seemed incapable of ever smiling sat on my thighs. My head was hanging down. Another man caught my hair and held my head down tight. Someone held down my hands and my legs. The guy who was sitting on me held a pipe from which water gushed with high pressure and he kept it pointed onto my nostrils so I couldn't breathe. If I tried to breathe from my mouth, then they would put water in my mouth. I was allowed to breathe for barely a second before they switched on the water. I felt as if my brain was filled with water. Then they propped me up and made me drink water from a jug. They gave me so much water that my stomach was swollen, and a man jumped on my stomach till water came out of my mouth. I saw light come into the room. It was morning. I was no longer thinking of home or my parents or anything else. All I could feel or think was pain. I had no control over my body. I urinated and defecated there. They gave me a little rest, but it was only because they were getting ready for the next round of torture. It occurred to me that torture was like routine. No one told anyone what to do. They had it all planned. From the next room, I heard screams of pain. I felt like sleeping, but I was not allowed to sleep. They said they had been awake all night, so I couldn't sleep either. I was shivering with cold and sneezing. Gupta ji asked me who was there in my home. I said only my mother because my father was away in his village. He told me to write a letter to my mother stating that I had to go away on urgent work and that I would return soon. They also asked me to tell my mother to hand over my passport and identity cards to the bearer of the letter. I tried to resist with whatever strength I had, but it was of little use. I had been broken and I had become their slave. Gupta ji went away, but my tormentors were ready with the next phase of their torture. A man stood with rollers on my thighs and rolled it up and down like they do for road construction. I felt like my muscles were becoming mincemeat. They did this 2 or 3 times and then they made me lie on my back. They pressed the rollers from the back of my thighs to my back. I could hear the bones breaking. I was screaming. I could not turn or move or lift myself. My legs were numb and I lay crumpled on the cold cement floor. My head felt so heavy. A man came in carrying a stethoscope, so I presumed he was a doctor. He checked my blood pressure. After that, I was given a cup of tea and a few stale slices of bread. The tea was watery. I was in the habit of having milk, but now tea tasted like nectar. I was propped up against the wall. I couldn't even hold the cup. Perhaps they put some medicine into the tea because I found some relief from the pain. I lost all sense of time. The torture continued on and on. I was allowed to sleep just enough to recover for the next session. The blankets were very rough and stinking with bed bugs crawling all over them. They kept asking me about the papers, and on one occasion, Gupta ji said that because of me, one of their agents had got caught. I couldn't understand what he was saying. My body was numb. I asked for water. They gave me water, but they mixed it with detergent and made me drink it. My stomach was filled with gas and I felt very uncomfortable. And just when I thought I'd been through it all, they brought battery and electric wires. They put the wires around my fingers and on my nipples. The battery was operated by hand. I do not know how many volts I was administered, but the jolts made me unconscious. I do not remember on which day, but one morning the nice guys came back. They said it was stupid of me to have put up with so much pain. I should just tell them what I've done with the papers. I said I was innocent. I repeated my story. This time, the nice guys sat around a table eating samosas and gulab jamun and sipping tea and coffee. The smell of food awakened my appetite and I felt so hungry. I was longing to have something to eat, but I didn't ask them and they didn't offer me anything either. I felt like I was dying. I said I was dying, but then they assured me, "तुझे मरने नहीं देंगे हम." It was more of a threat than a consolation. They were keeping me alive only so they could torture me further. They gave me roti and watery dal, but I couldn't open my mouth because my jaw seemed to have been dislocated. They threatened to force feed me, so I managed somehow to eat. One morning, they blindfolded me and took me outside. They had to support me. I could feel that I was walking on grass. I was made to hug a tree, and they pulled my arms around it, and the bark was very rough. Then they started to hit me on the back, and I screamed. I became unconscious. They hit me on the back of my legs and buttocks and spine, and then they took me back to the room, and then they removed the blindfold. I could hear the cries of pain of someone else being tortured in the next door. The police had now started playing cards while I was lying naked in the corner. In between, someone came and slapped me, and then the verbal abuse never stopped. They tortured me in shifts, normally at night. They would wake me up from my sleep by shining a flashlight on my face, then make me stand up and keep me standing for hours. If I was about to fall, they would let me sit down. It seemed like they tortured me just for the pleasure of seeing me in pain or humiliating me. They poked me with a needle, urinated on me, and on one occasion they put my hand under a chair and sat on it. Between the chair and my hand, there was something with a spike, and it hurt like mad. They even put petrol in my rectum, which made me scream. While interrogating me, they would routinely slap me, and one Subhash Tandon even burnt me with his cigarette butt. He was one officer whose name I can't forget because I saw him later in court. I'd got to know the names of several of my tormentors. By the fourth or fifth day, the torture was less. I'm not counting the occasional slap or the kick or the verbal abuse. They started to give me medicines 1 or 2 times a day, so the pain was less. One day I was blindfolded. I could walk with support and was made to climb up the stairs. The blindfolds were removed and I saw that I was in a lovely room with an air conditioner. There was a desk and the officers were sitting around me. Gupta ji again was present. But then there were also new faces that I hadn't seen before. Again, I was asked the same questions. They asked me what I had done in Karachi. I told them what I had done, how I had seen the tourist spots. They asked whether I got training in Pakistani intelligence services. They said everyone they had asked had been able to bring back papers, so why had I failed to do my job? No one in the past had been caught. I said I agreed to do the work out of patriotism, but I was too scared to carry it out. It was the simple truth, but they refused to believe it. It was a pleasure seeing a nice clean room, a carpet on the floor and furniture, but I was soon taken downstairs. This time when I entered the room, I immediately got the rancid smell of stained air. I felt that some vital decision about my future had been taken upstairs. So, without going into the details of what happens next, what happens is that he is asked to sign lots of blank papers so they can have written testimonies of him alleging his role in the Delhi bomb blasts, and when every time that Aamir Bhai, despite being tortured almost to death, he finds some courage to resist, he is tortured some more and his family is threatened. So I think I'm going to stop with the torture stories. So another important bit is that I want to read out a couple other important bits. There is this man called Shakil who is also convicted falsely under for the same crimes that Aamir Bhai has been convicted, and they became friends in jail. So basically I want to talk about the day that Shakil dies. Shakil was having his own share of sorrows. Both his daughters were reaching marriageable ages. He was worried about his family. He had been in jail for 10 years. He wondered whether he would get old before he could be free. We consoled each other. After all, we'd been acquitted in so many cases. But the attitude of the judge had made him really depressed. He'd lost all hope. So this is specifically true because of the 9/11 attacks, which changed the way judges perceived Muslim men, Muslim prisoners, specifically Muslim prisoners who were convicted under charges of terrorism. So initially there was some sympathy that was, leveled at those who have been awaiting trial, but now, despite the fact that there has not been a trial, despite the fact that they had been acquitted in so many cases that it was likely that they were being framed for for crimes they hadn't committed, just by the mere fact that they were Muslims, started to play against their hopes of finally being free from, jail. So I saw that, Aamir Bhai says, he saw that 4 or 5 days before Shakil's death, that Shakil had changed. He was much more irritable and he didn't speak so much, and he started strolling on his own. He didn't talk to anyone, even to me. I would see him making hand gestures as if he was talking to himself. He was mentally stressed. The warden also noticed and even asked me why he'd become like this in the past 3 years when he was okay for the last 10. I remember it was a hot afternoon in June 2009. Shakil and I were in our respective cells, he in cell number 5 and I in cell number 8. In between, there were two empty cells. It was around 2 or 3 in the afternoon, and I dozed off. Suddenly, I was woken up by unusual noises. I could hear people talking. One convict passed in front of myself, and I asked him what happened. He told me that Shakil had hanged himself. My heart started beating so fast when I saw the jail officers. The head warden asked me whether Shakil had said anything to me, and there was an eerie silence. I couldn't see things clearly. When they were taking Shakil's corpse, I only saw his feet. The warden said that they were taking him to the hospital. I hoped against hope that he would survive. That evening, I was not allowed out of my cell even for that 1 hour. So there was some time that was given to people in high security prisons to be able to leave their prisons. But that night he was not allowed to leave. Officers came, but they didn't tell me that he had died. I was told he was in the hospital. But then I was told finally that Shakil had made a noose with his bed sheets and hanged himself from the fan. I was also told that there was a piece of paper tied to his feet. I wanted to know what was written on the paper. My blood pressure shot up and I had to be admitted to the hospital. All of us prisoners demanded that we shown the paper tied to Shakil's foot. It was a suicide note and Superintendent V.K. Singh showed it to us. Shakil said that he was committing suicide because the trial was taking too long and the attitude of the judge showed that he wouldn't be given justice. The magistrate who made an inquiry didn't want to expose the fact that Shakil had been driven to commit suicide because of the judiciary, and so the blame for Shakil's suicide was firmly put on the jail. Shakil's brother also filed a case against the jail authorities. It is also said that the post-mortem report showed that Shakil had been poisoned, but I don't believe that that was true. I think it was part of the cover-up, and in the process, Superintendent V.K. Singh got arrested on charges of murder. There is another section of this book where Aamir Bhai talks about how his father dies and his last words to his son is, "Beta main tumhari tareekh pe nahi aa paya." So his father used to show up for all his trials and they were very poor, and he arranged for a lawyer with money they didn't have, and he used to get written slips. He used to come hours before the trial was about to begin, and he used to get slips written, typed out, which would allow him to meet his son or grant him, some extra access. So the one day that he didn't show up for trial, Aamir Bhai realized that his father was very ill. Okay, this is a bad time to get hiccups. So he didn't get to attend his father's funeral, but those were his last words. And in fact, there is Aamir Bhai has published. So what happened? When I finally came out of jail after nearly 14 years, I found among his papers small chits with dates, the endless dates for court hearings. Ammi had carefully kept all the chits among his papers in the trunk. So these are all the chits that his father had saved, which have the dates for all his trials. So the next section I want to read, and this will be the final section, is when Aamir Bhai is finally free. So this was the trial in 2011, but which has been going on since March 2010. Rajesh, who I think was his defense lawyer, right? if I'm not wrong. Yeah, Rajesh was his defense lawyer. So Rajesh was ready with his final arguments, but before he could begin, the judge told him it would not be necessary. Then the judge bent his head and scribbled something in his file, after which he looked up and turned to me and told me that I was free. As simple as that. I was taken back to jail. I shared my news with my fellow prisoners. They were very happy for me, and we celebrated the moment. I gave away my books and I packed my bags. I had only rupees 250 in my account. Then I felt scared. It was evening and no one was there to receive me. The key turned in the big lock, the door opened, and I stepped out with a bag in my hand and took a deep breath. I turned left and then I turned right. There were no guards. I had no handcuffs and I was truly free. I was alone, but I was free. I looked up at the sky. I turned left and walked in that direction. I went back and I turned to the right and walked in that direction. I was so thrilled that I could walk in any direction with no one telling me where to go. I wanted to feel my freedom. I turned back one last time to look at the gate of the jail and the tower of the walls. I didn't look back again. Luckily for me, the Rohtak jail at that time was right in the middle of the town and I had to just cross the road to reach the bus stand. But I felt scared crossing the road. For nearly 14 years, I had not crossed a road on my own. It was growing dark and I was feeling a growing sense of insecurity. I managed to cross the road and reach the bus stand. Then I asked for an STD booth from which I dialed my sister's telephone number. Appy picked up the phone. She just wouldn't believe that I was speaking to her, that I was free and that I was coming home. She couldn't believe me. I told her I was at the bus stop. I wanted someone to know where I was in case the police decided to kidnap me again. If I disappeared again, my sister could testify that I had phoned from the bus at Rohtak. So it's important here to see that even if he's free, he knows that the danger hasn't been averted. The fact that he's still looking out for phantom kidnappers shows that, he hasn't forgotten what has happened to him. And why should he? How could he? I got on to the Haryana Roadways bus going to Delhi. I sat down and waiting for the bus to start. Felt a growing anxiety that the jail authorities may come and get me again. I saw small children get into the bus and watched with fascination their small hands and feet. It felt odd sitting in the company of ladies. The bus started off and I noticed the traffic and saw vendors coming to the bus windows to sell small packets of peanuts. It was dark and the street lights seemed to be so bright. I kept a sharp lookout for the police in case they suddenly pounced on me from somewhere. At last we entered Delhi and I was amazed at how brightly lit it was. I admired the broad roads and looked with awe at the crowds of the busy people going in all directions. I noticed there were clocks on traffic lights which told you how many minutes there were for the lights to change. I saw a metro station and I was amazed. For the first time I saw huge buildings which I learned later were shopping malls. The bus stopped at the interstate bus. So, you must remember he was jailed in 1997, 98 and he's out in 2011. There have been extraordinary technological advancements. Bus stopped at the interstate bus terminal at Kashmiri Gate, but with all the underbridges and flyovers, I almost didn't recognize where I was. I got an auto and asked him to take me to Old Delhi. I arrived back in my neighborhood. There were many shops and it was much more crowded than I remembered, but much of it had also remained the same. The narrow lanes, uneven roads, and the tangle of electrical wires were all the same. I heard the azan for Isha ki Nawaz. It was at this time nearly 14 years ago that I'd left home for the night prayers, and after the namaz I hadn't returned. Now that I was returning again, I felt like a stranger. I came back to, I saw that Ammi was lying on the bed. When she saw me, she knew that I'd come back home. But she couldn't get up, she couldn't speak. I held her tightly and I didn't let her go. I told her, Ammi Jaan, main aa gaya hoon. She'd become so thin and her once plump face had wasted away. After everyone had gone, I climbed up to the roof and sat there watching the stars. If only Abu had been there. So the story does have, his story does have a happy ending. He marries a woman who waited for him for 15 years, believing him and his innocence. His story finds, gets gets attention from human rights activists, and he gets the kind of support he needs to help his family, to help his mother. But there is this section about freedom where he says, one second. I still live in fear because the situation in our country isn't good. Many Muslim youth are targeted and picked up by police, and I still feel vulnerable. There are still 2 appeals pending in High Court, and I hope I'll be acquitted. Sometimes I wish I could leave India, my country, and settle somewhere safe. But then I wonder where that place is. And this ties in with what Nandita and Haksar, where she talks about in the first half of the book, where she talks about how the acquittal of Muslim youth in India is lower than China and in US, that the population of Muslims in prisons in those countries are higher inside the prisons than there is a total population in the country. So it seems as if there is a global fear and propaganda to slander, which has spread slander about Muslims, and he's not in jail, but he's not entirely free either. And so I haven't read his book. So this is Aamir Bhai's story. I'm sorry, I'm a little flustered. It's because there's actually so much of his story that I didn't talk about, because I think even to the extent that I spoke about his story, it takes a toll on you emotionally and mentally. You can't just read these words and feel distant from them. At some level, one starts to imagine either him or someone you love, care about, maybe even yourself in that situation. And just the fact that life has leveled such awful tragedies upon you, and the fact that he still retains his fighting spirit. He still holds on to his secular values. He still believes in the idea of a united India where all people of all faiths can live together in harmony. The fact that he does that despite everything that has happened to him, I find that so commendable. And although his body and his spirit was broken to such an extensive degree, he has sustained lifelong injuries, like he talks about them in his book. But the fact that he has this ember of hope that has been kept alive, and he that's the part of him that he fosters and he talks about most. Which, in fact, there is a section of his book where he talks about the fact that he still wakes up with nightmares about those days of torture and he needs psychiatric help. But that doesn't mean that he has lost hope. So I suppose that's the end of the podcast. I'm sorry, I don't know, I didn't have a planned ending to this. It's very hard to have anything, because this is such a difficult story to swallow, to tell, to read out. The fact that I know Aamir Bhai, and when I imagine him having gone through all this, it doesn't seem real, but it is. And Yes, well, it's hard. Ah, right. Okay. So, I hope this has helped you make sense of the state of affairs of people from minority communities in India and in other countries. Um, and even though they refuse to bow down to oppression and repression and horrible, awful circumstances, let's never forget that things are more complicated and more difficult than they may seem, and what is within the purview of our experience is not the whole truth, and that we must seek far and low to find out what it is and not limit ourselves to what we think we know to be true. And however difficult it may be to swallow someone else's truth, it's imperative that we do so. And that's what I would like to end this by. Okay. I hope you've got something out of this, and I hope you pick up this book. Again, this is Framed as a Terrorist, my 14-year struggle to prove my innocence by Mohammad Aamir Khan and Nandita Haksar.